afternoon, Milwaukee. This is the Mark Belling Late Afternoon Show on News Talk 1130 WISN. Let me plant a seed, and we'll grow that tree later on in the program. Hillary Clinton made that statement publicly a few weeks ago to Joe Biden that under no circumstances should he concede defeat on election night. When she said that, first of all, that's a weird statement. Well, what do you mean? What if Trump has carried 375 electoral votes? What if it's not close? I mean, I certainly understand if it's a close election or one that you think that you could overturn at the courts, why you wouldn't concede, but why did you say under no circumstances? Anyway, we plant that seed and we're going to revisit the whole area in a moment. A little bit later on in the program. Also, for those of you who are not aware, the Sizzling Summer Cash Contest, that's over. So we don't have a word this hour, and for that matter, we don't have a word any of those hours. The company has been doing, iHeartMedia has been doing this for years now, these texting contests, and win $1,000 or a similar prize and so on. So hopefully there'll be another one that'll come around sometime soon, but that one is over. So don't gripe to Paul if you haven't heard the word, because there is no word. If you were listening to the end of Vicky's show, she was discussing a topic, but she made a point kind of in passing about all of the things that we would have thought would be impossible, just weird behavior that's suddenly been normalized and accepted. And she made reference to the tampons in the men's rooms, the schools having bathrooms for, if a girl wants to be a boy wants to be a girl, and just going through a whole list of them. The fact of the matter is that you could come up with any number of things that would have been unthinkable in this country 10 years ago that are now not only thinkable, but they're happening. And the thing that struck me about almost all of them is the vast majority of them are not things that the majority of Americans have supported, but nobody really did anything to stop it from happening. There are a lot of things that fit into that category. I think what you're seeing right now, the decision in many cities to simply allow rioting to go on, and the condemnation of police officers, the taking of a very radical Marxist agenda and putting it in place in public schools all over the country in the name of the Black Lives Matter curriculum. Kettle Moraine, the latest to go down that path. Again, I could come up with all the examples, but then I'm not going to specifically talk about anything, but there are so many things that are going on that I don't think most Americans support, but hardly anybody does anything to stop it. And the more of these things that we accept without anybody doing anything to stop it, the harder it's going to be to stop anything in the future. The left is very, very good at using tactics that allow them to get done things that hardly anybody supports. And one of the best tactics is to claim that you're a bigot if you oppose them. So even if the majority of the people oppose it because nobody wants to be called a bigot, they don't come up with any opposition. I can tell you that at some prominent companies here in southeastern Wisconsin, people are terrified to express themselves on anything on social media right now because they know the company is watching what they have to say. The indoctrination sessions that are going on at some of these companies, all I'm getting from people is complaints about them, but they complain to me because they know that they can't do anything internally. If they complain internally, they'll likely be fired for being one of the things that we're indoctrinating people not to be. Just going back to the beginning of the year, when you take a look at the number of things that you just would have thought, well, that'll never happen, that have happened. Now, I'm an analytical person. I always like to try to figure out why. And in particular, why have so many of us simply rolled over and accepted a lot of the things that have happened to us? Here's my answer. I think you've had two things that have gone on in our society. One, certain of our institutions have become overwhelmingly dominated by people who have a minority viewpoint. In other words, radical liberals. There are a handful of, even though radical liberals are a minority of the country, there are some institutions where they are the overwhelming majority of the people in those institutions. The media, university education, public education, which isn't quite as extreme as university education, but way up there. The arts. And when I say the arts, I mean broadly, the performing arts, Hollywood, TV, music, so on. Those institutions have become overwhelmingly dominated by people that are radical liberals. Now, I'm going to add in another one. The government bureaucracy itself, the people who work for government, as a group, people who work for government are way more liberal than the overall population. Now, this in my mind has always been one of those chicken versus the egg arguments. What comes first? Take, for example, in Wisconsin, state government is centered in Madison, which is an extremely liberal city. Is Madison an extremely liberal city because state government is based there? Or do the people who work for state government, are they extremely liberal because the state capital is in Madison? Now, the answer is probably it's both, and it feeds on one another. So you get these handful of fields in life that become overwhelmingly dominated by radical liberals. That's the one part of what I want to explain that's happening. The second part is this. For as skeptical and cynical we Americans are, we give unbelievable credibility to people who are experts. It's just extraordinary, really. If someone says that they're an expert, we just start panting away and, automatically accept without any question what it is that they say, because after all, they're an expert. I'll use a couple of examples to make my point. The old stories about before they had the diagnostic equipment for the cars and all that, you take your old car into the auto repair place, and if you didn't know anything about the mechanicals of a car, which is about half of men and probably 75 to 80% of women, if you didn't go to a reputable place, they could claim, well, you need to do this and this and this and this and this and this. And people might have some skepticism because this is going to cost them money, but they're not in a position to object because they don't know what's wrong with their car. When we feel as though we don't have a lot of knowledge in a certain area, we give total credence to whatever experts tell us. Now, the key was the first part. If you don't think you know anything about a certain subject. If you think you're very knowledgeable about a subject, you don't pay any attention to the experts because you feel you're pretty much of an expert yourself. Sports would be an example of that. Just about every sports fan thinks that they're as knowledgeable as the people that are out there, the commentators and the coaches and so on. Well, and most fans are as knowledgeable as the commentators, but obviously the coaches, people are, the coach did this, he must know. No. People think that they have a high degree of knowledge, so they're willing to question that sort of thing. But if it's something in which you don't have a high degree of knowledge on, you're willing to turn the thinking over to the so-called expert. Now, those two factors that I just mentioned, certain fields that have become overwhelmingly dominated by radical liberals, not just liberals, but radical liberals, and the tremendous deference that we give to so-called experts. Here's how they come together. Almost all of the decisions that I've been describing that you would have thought of over the last 5 to 10 years that just would have been unthinkable have come from the several institutions that I described. Government, higher education, public education, the media, the culture. Secondly, in most of those areas, the decisions were made by people, the general public here would probably grant, well, I don't have a lot of expertise in this area. So we turned over and gave tremendous deference to these institutions, which just happened to be dominated by radical liberals. You see how the two fit together? This is what's happened. There are some fields, in fact, quite a few fields, where the experts don't have a lot of expertise. I remember way back when I was going to college a million years ago. It was a joke that kind of ran through the dorms back at that time. You could always tell which kids in college weren't that smart. We settled across to the ones that go over to Morris Hall. You know what Morris Hall was? That was the Department of Education. Or what do they call it? College of Education. In other words, that's where the people went who were majoring in education, which meant that they would go on to be teachers. We were kind of joking. Nobody really thought all those kids that were majoring in it were stupid, but it was sort of a joke that that you just didn't sense that there were going to be any nuclear physicists that were heading their way over there, because if they were nuclear physicists, or they were really, they'd probably be majoring in something other than that. Well, I think the people who went into education 40 years ago were a lot sharper than some of the ones that go into it now. But, as I say, here's another saying that goes back decades. This isn't new for teachers that would be insulted by this. This is a new statement. Those who can't do, teach. I bet that saying's 50 years old. I can tell you, in the field that I'm in, the people that seem to know the least about the field that I'm in, radio, are the people that consult radio stations. So-called experts in radio. They're not experts. They may be people who have been given that position, but they don't really know that much more than the average person who's in the field. How do I explain this? Well, I explain it this way. Having technical knowledge of something is only part of what makes somebody really, really smart. You can have two people that trained in any particular thing, doctors, two doctors that went through the same exact courses in medical school, same exact, and maybe even got the same grades. One of them goes on to be a brilliant doctor and the other one can't get anything figured out. Having the technical expertise is only part of what makes you really, really smart in any field. You have to have the ability to apply it. This is why some of the fields that we have, the so-called experts are wrong all the time. We've joked about the climate change people. They've never made a prediction yet that I'm aware of that has turned out to be correct. Which is why they have come up with this umbrella term climate change, because the one thing that we do know is that at some point the climate is going to change. But when their projections about when Miami was going to be underwater, when all the glaciers were going to melt, that we were not going to have human life. I think, what did AOC say? We have like 10 years left or whatever, or 12 years. Al Gore said by 2020, Al Gore would have us dead by now. There are other fields that are that fall into this category as well. And unfortunately, as I say, I think education is one of them. For decades, we have been pushing on kids this notion of whole language and creative spelling. Well, even the experts themselves have pretty much abandoned it. It's going to take a long time to purge it out of the schools because so many of the teachers have been trained to teach reading through these methods. I mentioned that last year, The Department of Public Instruction, Evers' own agency, came out and said that this is not the preferred method of teaching, that it is just clear that phonics is superior. This is after 40 years of people who have objected to whole language saying this is wrong, this is bad, 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 this is bad. And now the experts are finally acknowledging, you know what, I guess it was bad. They're not saying they're wrong. Well, we have new information that now leads to such and such. But during that entire 40-year period, almost everybody in society, parents, taxpayers, bought into this crap. Why? Well, we're not experts on teaching reading. We figured they must know. Those 3 words, they must know. What if they don't? Well, how can they not know? They're experts. Now, follow me on this. Remember, I said certain fields are dominated by radical liberals. And unfortunately, education is one of them. And the higher up you get in education, the more dominated it is. It's almost impossible to find a staunch conservative school superintendent of Wisconsin or curriculum director or position like that. If there are staunch conservatives, they're generally just regular old teachers. Very, very hard for somebody with a conservative ideology to move way up in the hierarchy, because the hierarchy is filled by other people who are going to choose people who think the way that they think. So how do you get certain fields in which the experts don't have a lot of expertise? Well, I'll use a saying that's very popular: garbage in, garbage out. Who trains someone to be an expert? Other experts. Well, what if the first group of experts isn't very sharp at doing anything? What happened, I believe, during, and this is where we're going to go as I'm going to move this forward, the first example I'm going to cite, the COVID-19 lockdowns and so on. Well, the experts say, and you know what? Almost all the experts were saying the same thing, with the exception of a handful of dissenters who came out from the very beginning and challenged almost all of this. The vast majority said the same thing. Why? It wasn't like all of them on their own were with fresh eyes saying, okay, there's this is what I think we should do. No, they're simply taking the lead from the top experts. All these health directors in Wisconsin, you think they sat back and they thought through what the response should be? No. They're all just playing follow the leader. This one says this one says this, which is how an approach that we've never done before in the history of this country suddenly becomes the approach we take, because none of these experts actually were expert enough to break away from the pack. Now, here's the thing about the pack. The pack, by definition, is mediocre in anything. Mediocre kind of means average. So a large group of anything is going to regress essentially to average. The people who make a difference in life and the people who screw everything up in life are people who break from the pack. The thing about breaking from the pack is, and you're going to do something that nobody else kind of thinks is the thing to do, or you think your own direction, there's a good chance that what you're coming up with is really, really stupid. It's also very, very possible that what you're coming up with is really, really brilliant. For most of the others, they just stay within the pack, which is why most people in any given field are somewhere in the middle. You get a handful, like some doctors, you get a handful of heart surgeons who just seem to kill everybody that they ever operate on, and they get sued for malpractice, and you get others who becomes the most preeminent heart surgeons in the world. Everybody else is sort of in the middle. So we give, going back to my point, we give great deference to the experts. Just as for 40 years, we gave great deference to the people who come up with, the reading curriculums. And we've been, 30 years of doing this show, and even before then, we talked about how parents and many others, some others would question this approach toward reading. And you would get from so many people that, the teachers must know, the curriculum directors must know, the university people must know. Unfortunately for us, this attitude of deference towards so-called experts has gotten worse. Worse. I'll give you an example. You got a 7-year-old kid. 7-year-old kid has 2 arms, 2 legs, head, chest, and you know what, hanging down from between the legs. That's a boy! But the experts are telling us it's not. The experts are telling us it's whatever that child believes he or she is. To accept this, as we have, is giving unbelievable deference to experts. But again, the so-called experts who make this determination, they are involved in a field that is overwhelmingly dominated by radical liberals. Most fields that we have in society, most people who own a hardware store franchise, all the people who own a hardware store franchise or even an independent hardware store, one that doesn't have, like, franchise would be Ace and True Value and so on, or an independent one. Take all the people in the United States who own hardware stores. That is not a group that is dominated by radical liberals. But as I say, there are certain fields that are. 72 counties in Wisconsin, almost all of them have public health directors. Some have joint departments like Ozaukee, Washington. And then you have a lot of individual cities. Some of them have health directors. I don't know what the number is, but I'll make something up. Let's suppose it's 250 public health directors in Wisconsin. I might be high, as I say, some counties have a joint department. Then you have Milwaukee County, where every city has their own public health department, plus there's a county. So let's just say it's 250, whatever it is, right? Of those 250, how many of the 250 do you believe are going to vote for Joe Biden for president? I bet 240. In other words, I bet it's over 90%, whatever the total number of them is. I bet it's over 90%. In other words, that particular field, for whatever reason, has become one that has been dominated by liberals. So going back to how you end up doing things that would have been unthinkable. We have a case of a version of the flu, which is, I think, a fair way of describing COVID-19. It's technically not a flu, but it's a virus that has many flu-like characteristics that you would end up shutting down all of society, gutting the economy, canceling all live events, closing schools, banning parties at colleges, that are all the stuff we've done. If you would have said that you would do this over a glorified flu that was worse than most, but not the worst we've ever had, we would not do that. There's no way the American public is going to put up with that. That Northwestern Mutual's downtown office building would be closed for 7 months running. No, there's just no way. I mean, they spent all that money. They're not going to do that over something. That's just not going to happen. That's what people would have said January 1st, and I would have said that January 1st. But all this stuff happened because once it started to come down, the public health experts said we should do such and such. And the media, which, remember, this is from the same pool, dominated by radical liberals, gave total deference to the public health experts. Here's the thing about this. The media does not give total deference to anything other than other groups that are dominated by radical liberals. But if the group is dominated by radical liberals, the media gives them deference. In other words, radical liberals, it's kind of like, you wonder how a dog knows. Dogs don't look at all alike, if you know what I'm saying, right? I mean, a poodle doesn't look anything like a German Shepherd. We know that they're both dogs because we're trained to know that they're dogs, right? How do the dogs know that? How does the dog know that that isn't like a completely different species of animal? They all seem to know. Here, one dog comes walking on the dog starts barking like crazy when the other one is coming. If some donkey was walking down the street, the dog probably leave it alone. In other words, the dogs all somehow know who all the other dogs are. The groups that are dominated by radical liberals all know who the other groups that are dominated by radical liberals are, and they give them incredible deference. Another institution that's falling into this category is professional athletes. It seems to be dominated right now by radical liberals. Not the people who own the teams and not necessarily the people who run the teams, but many of the athletes themselves. And the media, therefore, takes their side and gives them total deference when they decide they're going to kneel for anthems or take up this cause or pull a George Hill and decide you're not going to do your job because you don't like the fact that a cop shot somebody or whatever. So the media now is our form of communication. So here's what you have. You have one group of so-called experts saying do such and such. And then you have the mouthpiece for society, the media, saying that these people are right and we need to do them. Now the general public, which probably is very skeptical about this, but figure, well, they must know. Because as I say, we give incredible deference and we're not knowledgeable in a subject. And how knowledgeable are most people in viruses? We don't know anything about virus. The average, what do we know? We know, yeah, okay, it's a virus. So you presume that the so-called experts have incredible knowledge. This would be fine if the experts you were giving this deference to were not radical liberals. But when we do it to a group dominated by radical liberals, we end up doing things that turn out to be unbelievably stupid and overwhelmingly not supported by the majority. Thus, boys using girls' bathrooms in elementary schools and so on. Or nobody going to a sporting event all year. Or office towers remaining empty. All the stuff that we have seen. It is after the fact that two things happen. Often, when something that is pushed at us by experts turns out to be a debacle, the experts themselves say, well, it's time to rethink the approach. It's never, we're morons and we came up with a dumb thing. No, there's no new evidence. However, this often takes decades. For school busing, decades. The quackery in teaching reading methods, decades. We don't know with regard to the approach to public health concerns other than that, as I've been pointing out, they simply are not long-term sustainable. Every time we have a bug that comes through, we can't shut down the entire economy and pass multi-trillion-dollar stimulus packages. You just can't. Maybe you can pull it off once in a lifetime, but you can't do it again in 3 or 4 years. So it may be by simple necessity that we would have to take another approach the next time around. I believe that most Americans do not believe that if people are rioting and burning down a city and smashing up buildings, that the police should let them do it. But in the communities where this is going on, almost all of them communities dominated by liberals, incredible deference is again given to the so-called experts, which are the community leaders which allow them to do it. This is why it will be quite interesting to see what happens as these things continue to move into medium-sized cities. Now, in Wisconsin, the two medium-sized cities that they moved into are Wauwatosa and Kenosha. Both are run by Democrats. What will happen if the next one in Wisconsin happens to come into a city that's run by conservatives? There was, for example, a different approach taken over the weekend, the situation in Rochester, New York, where there was a much more aggressive confrontation by the police and the authorities, who were determined not to let Rochester become Kenosha, than you saw in Kenosha. Now, New York State still has a Democratic governor in Cuomo, but the city officials there may have sized up and learned from the disastrous decision that was made in Kenosha to essentially allow them to burn down everything that they felt like burning down, that they made a different decision. I believe that this has been a clear decision by BLM and Antifa and other radicalized organizations that they intend to bring hell to pay into these medium-sized cities. And it's not going to stop. So it will be interesting to see what happens if, I don't even want to name a city, but there are cities the size of, I'd say, when I say a medium-sized city, I mean somewhere between 35 and 120,000. Get a zillion of them in Wisconsin. And not all of them are run by liberals. If there's a police shooting or something controversial, or some cops are accused of hammering a guy too hard and beating an African American or whatever it is in some community, and the radicals pour into that city and it's one that's not dominated by liberals, will there be the same awful response that we saw in Kenosha, or will there be an attempt to immediately enforce the law? We don't know, because it's not been tested yet. Almost every city in the United States that has seen insurrection here in 2020 is totally run by liberals. Chicago, everybody. Governor, county executive, mayor, city council. Portland, Oregon, governor, the mayor, city council. Seattle, Washington, governor. All these are completely liberal communities where there is no conservative control. All we've had is a Republican president who has offered to send in federal assistance, but has been rebuffed in many of those communities. As I have said with regard to the rioting and the protesting, it's not going to stop on its own. It's only going to stop when it's stopped. Likewise, all of these moves in our society and doing things that I think the majority do not support. This will not stop on its own. It will only stop when citizens insist on it being stopped. I would use as an example Wauwatosa, which, as you know, has rolled over to protests which have been rowdy, loud, not peaceful, but predominantly nonviolent, with the exception of the terrible incident that occurred at Officer Mentz's girlfriend's house. I believe, as you know, and I could be wrong, but I believe that unless they simply find another community to go and pick on, that the Wauwatosa situation will get worse. And it's not going to go away. It will continue until the majority of the residents of Wauwatosa have finally decided that they're going to stop putting up with community leaders who have allowed this to go on. The same is true with regard to all of the other things that I've mentioned in society. Every community in Wisconsin that has girls going to the boys' bathroom and so on has a school board that's allowed it to occur. Now, for the average person, again, they give tremendous deference to experts. Well, maybe these boys are really girls, and maybe the experts who are now into this gender reassignment, and they will, we are moving toward a point in which I think that gender is going to move in the exact same direction as Indian nicknames, that it will be considered sexist to say that anyone is a man or a woman or a boy or a girl. I believe that is what's happening. And if you think that that's far-fetched, as I say, look how far we've already come. Who would have thought 25 years ago that you wouldn't have any of these Indian school nicknames anywhere, that would be considered a racist thing? Who would have thought almost any of this stuff? And again, all these things are things that I think the vast majority oppose, but it's put upon them anyway, because the people that make the recommendations or the decisions are overwhelmingly dominated by liberals, and we give them, as I say, tremendous deference. On the subject of experts, how do doctors learn the advances that are going on in the medical field? I don't mean when you're in medical school. I mean your doctor now. Do you know? I know. They read. They read the literature, and they read, I think I have a very good doctor. He's aware, okay, there's this that's happened over here, and that's happened over there, and so on. That's how they all learn anything. Same thing with a public health expert. They read. They read what other public health experts are telling them. As long as you don't process the information and come up with your own expert approach to that information that's out there, all that's happening is we essentially have 4 experts in every field, and they tell all the other experts what you're supposed to think. And that's what's happened with COVID. If the people at the top had said, we're not going to do lockdowns, that herd immunity is the way to go, we would have gone herd immunity, and you would not have gotten hardly anybody in the United States calling for lockdowns. And they all would have said, no, lockdowns, because they're all just playing follow the leader. even in, I would say, Washington County is the most conservative county in the state of Wisconsin. You had tremendous deference given to the Ozaukee, Washington Health Department, which has been, run by the queen of the lockdowns, running around spying on people and doing all of this crap, closing county fairs and so on. Even there was deference given. Well, they must know what they're doing. She was doing lockdowns because everybody else was doing lockdowns. And Andrea Palm said, hey, well, we're going to do lockdowns. And as I say, birds of a feather do flock together in these fields that you're in. It's remarkable the number of fields we have in which the ideology, political and social ideology, is overwhelmingly in one direction. I mentioned the hardware store owner. What percentage of people who own hardware stores in the United States are going to vote for Donald Trump? I'd say over 80. That's my point. Just as of the public health directors in the state of Wisconsin, over 90% are going to vote for Biden. Birds of a feather flock together. And I don't even mean that insultingly. It's just a matter of who goes into what field. And part of it is, what? Well, I came up with the 5 overwhelmingly dominant liberal fields, the performing arts, higher education, secondary, regular old public education, and so on. And that list, birds of a feather flock together. Now, the same thing is true with certain entities, certain institutions that we have on the right in which the overwhelming majority might be conservative. The same thing can occur with regard to, I've struggled to come up with a term on this, but I have identified and talked for the last 15 years how extraordinary I find what we are doing right now in geographically segregating ourselves by ideology. How did it get to be that virtually everybody who lives in Shorewood is a lefty? How did that happen? Well, it happened the same way that virtually everybody who lives in New Berlin is a conservative. Now, there are some liberals who live in New Berlin and some conservatives who live in Shorewood, but we see the voting patterns. Both are overwhelmingly to the side that they're on. It's probably similar to deciding what kind of a field that you go into. It might be partly that people who are liberal-minded kind of like to live in sort of more dense type of environments. Houses are nice in Shorewood, but it's dense with not the very large yards and so on. Whereas people who are more conservatively minded might like to have a larger yard, which is more than a Berlin thing. I don't know. It may also be, again, the birds of a feather flock together, that if you're a more conservative person, you don't want to live in with a pack of lefties. So it becomes a snowball effect. And a lot of people think that that's what's going to happen with the cities right now, with an exodus of some people leaving cities because of the things that have gone on, that the cities are going to become even more liberal and the suburbs are going to become even more conservative because what remaining conservatives move out of cities. Again, it's too early to tell on that because we don't know long term whether or not rioting is a phenomenon of 1 or 2 years or if it's going to be the next phenomenon for the next 30. We don't know. So this lengthy introduction here of this deference given to experts. Well, they must know. I'll give you another. In fact, let me give you another field where I find that this has happened. It's one that I've talked. What did I just say? I've nailed your street and neighborhood. What do you mean? I know, but I'm just saying that might be that more conservative people are more interested in that and more liberal people are interested in a dense type population. I don't know. Or it might simply be that if you hear that an area is rather conservative and you're conservative minded, you go over there yourself. It's also I think, certainly true that people who don't have strong ideologies take the ideology that surrounds them. In other words, we're sponges. That's the case with Hollywood. How did Hollywood become overwhelmingly liberal? It's because most people who go to Hollywood don't have any political viewpoints at all when they start out and they get over there and they see everybody else is a liberal and they want to fit in, and so they become the same thing. That would be true of many people who are not particularly, overwhelmingly political. They're in an area where all their friends have a certain opinion, or maybe their spouse has an opinion, and since they don't have strong opinions of their own, they sort of move in that direction, or they're influenced by the things that they hear. That's part of it as well. One that I've talked about for a long time on this show, again, where we give incredible deference to so-called experts, and it's one that has driven me crazy. There's an element of we challenge and argue about almost everything the government does, with the exception of two areas. We never challenge them in education. And the other government institution that so many people never want to challenge is the Federal Reserve. It's just remarkable. You can go back to all of them. Go back to when Greenspan had the job for 850 years. Most people feel as though they don't have a strong sense of monetary policy. And they're very, very questioning, well, you shouldn't criticize the Fed. They must know what they're doing. Again, the incredible deference that's given to so-called experts. Where because we don't feel qualified ourselves to make these decisions, we simply accept the approach that's taken from above. If we were more willing to use the brains that God gave us and question some of these things that I think are frankly unbelievably stupid, like the belief that somehow you're less likely to spread a virus when you're packed onto a subway train or a bus, which all over America have continued to operate, than if you're sitting, say, in a sports stadium, which all over America have been empty. Why would people think that somehow being in a sports stadium is likely to spread the virus, but being in a packed mass transit unit is not? No, again, I've got a brain. I just came up with that thing on my own. But most people have shown incredible deference to the experts that have pushed these certain approaches. As I say, the experts are just taking their lead from other experts. Most of them don't think on their own, and most of them would have a very, very hard... Can you imagine if just one county health director in Wisconsin said, I don't believe we should shut anything down. But there isn't one. There isn't one. And it's not my fault. I live in a lefty area, Milwaukee. What am I going to get? Lefties. Who's to blame for that other than me? But I honestly think it's worse if you live in a conservative area and you've got these lefties that are shoving you around like this, that you don't know enough to challenge them. Well, they must know. What if they don't? Do you know how many times the they has been wrong? I'll give you another example. Abe Lincoln. I'm racing back. Now, if you're under 35, you don't know any of these things because, unfortunately, you've not been taught American history. You've just been given ideologies by quack lefty teachers. But Abraham Lincoln, in the fighting of the Civil War, was being driven crazy by his generals. Throughout American history, it's remarkable how many just absolute dopes we have gotten that have risen to the level of general. From the beginning of the time of our country, the generals who end up making a difference were the ones that ended up being able to be given authority, have the authority that was taken away from the ones who screwed everything up. Lincoln, in fighting the Civil War, was frustrated as could be that he had generals that were not willing to go out and attack and kill. They kept playing defense and they didn't want to take risks. And he kept going through his changing up, and nobody was willing to fight. Then he found drunken old Ulysses S. Grant, whose drinking was probably somewhat overstated, but Grant was a wild man. But he believed strongly in attacking and bringing the fight to the enemy, and it was not until Grant came in that the war turned around. Now, let's imagine Lincoln was somebody like the rest, like we are with regard to, well, whoever the first generals were, I don't even reckon who was the first one, I don't remember. Well, the generals must know, the generals must know, the generals must know. Vietnam was another example of that to make it more contemporary. It was the most butchered, botched war in the history of this country. It was butchered and botched by the Harvard crowd that was in the State Department, the McNamara, Dean Rusk bunch, and the generals that came out of West Point. Westmoreland ran the thing out there. Yeah, Creighton Abrams might have been in the Joint Chiefs. Some of the names are sort of escaping me right now. But the strategy that they had in fighting that war is the reason that we lost the war. It was almost as if you wanted to, let's kill off as many Americans as we can and accomplish nothing in doing it. Now, maybe the war wasn't winnable because maybe the South Vietnamese government never really had the support of its people anyway. But that was another case where the great undoing of Kennedy and especially Johnson was Johnson escalated the war, but he escalated the war by following the advice of the generals, and the generals did not know what they were doing. And there were many retired generals who at the time were saying so. Some of them were described as kooks, Curtis LeMay and so on. But they had that differing opinion. So anyway, that's the groundwork that I want to use to move into a topic or two here. This notion that when the so-called experts say we should do something, that we have to automatically roll over and accept it. I think another perfect example is this idea of closing down schools or doing virtual learning, not understanding the incredible damage that we're doing to these children because somehow there's this terrible fear that you're going to spread this virus, which isn't even that big of a deal for kids, if you let the kids go back in. Well, but the experts are saying that we shouldn't go in there, and the experts are saying this, and the experts are saying that, and again, so many people just roll over and accept this rather than understand that in this case, the so-called experts are simply giving deference to crybaby, lazy-ass teachers who either A, are afraid to go in because they're scared of getting the virus, or B, just want to sit on their big, lard butts and do a 5-minute lesson per hour and slap it up on Zoom and say they're teaching. I have heard just over the last few, I had some friends in over the weekend. They were telling me about somebody that they know who's now, she's a 7th grade girl. I'll be vague about this. They said, it's clear. She's depressed. When they say depressed, she's depressed. That she used to always be this very bright girl she's just depressed. She's sad and she's downcasted. She's got to stay home all the time. She can't do anything with her friends. She's lost her social contact. She was a kid who loved school, was active in school, that have been taken from her. So this child's depressed. Look at what we're doing to these kids, all in the name of stopping the virus from being spread. How many of these kids are going to have complexes for the rest of their lives because we've scared them to death over something that they needn't have been scared of really at all? And whose approach was this? Well, that's what the experts said. Because again, the rest of us could not see through that the experts did not have a lot of expertise in this area. And let me finally go to the break. Here's the other thing. If the field that we're talking about is overwhelmingly dominated by radical liberals, that field's experts, therefore, will be radical liberals who happen to be the experts in that field, right? When's the last time radical liberals were right about anything? So they're not going to be right about anything in the field that they're in because they are never, ever, ever right about anything that they ever try to come up with. This is how you can have 100 years of history of communism in our world and 140 years of socialism being pushed around as an ideology and still have some people believe it's a good idea when every time it's been tried, it's been a train wreck and a debacle. Another area in which so-called experts in fields that are dominated by radical liberals think that this is a good idea, even though it's already been disproven. And 11:30 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. Some of you know who Michael Barone is. I've actually met him. Barone's been around a long time. I don't know if he still does it, but he used to be the guy who I think it was every 2 years, put out something called the Almanac of American Politics. It was back in the days in which people still read books because most of the stuff was not available on the internet. He probably does it now and it's web-based or whatever. But it would go through in unbelievable detail every one of the congressional districts in the United States and go into the demographics and the voting patterns. And the guy, was an encyclopedia of knowledge on the demographics of the United States, politics of the United States, and so on. He worked for U.S. News and World Report for a long time. He's been a pundit on a lot of these, talking head shows on TV and been around a while. Barone's probably in his 60s, maybe even over 70. In other words, he's been around a long, long time. He's a right of center, but not staunch conservative. But most of what he's done hasn't been really opinion-based as it is factual analysis. In fact, some of you who watch Fox, he was the guy that was one of the people that ran their decision desk for calling elections on election night for the longest time, Michael Barone. Anyway, Barone is in his syndicated column, which appears in the New York Post and other newspapers. He's done an analysis piece with regard to looking back at the 6 months of lockdowns here in the United States and whether or not it was a mistake. Now remember, Barone's not a pound-the-table, staunch, ranting and raving right-winger like I am. What he's trying to do here is what he likes to do is take a look at the evidence and go back and say, well, is this a good idea? Is that a good idea? He's kind of a stats guy. And he's taken a look at the evidence with regard to the lockdowns, and he's quoting the fact that there is it's not a consensus yet, but there is a growing movement now of dissenters against these lockdowns. I mentioned Greg Yip in the Wall Street Journal. This guy, Alex Berenson, who used to write for the New York Times, he's been commenting. A number of others are now pounding the table that locking down society is really stupid, that what we should have done all along, once the initial flattening the curve thing had been accomplished, was understand that contagious diseases are going to work through society and that we might be doing far more damage by the lockdown than whatever good you're doing in trying to stop the spread of something that can't be stopped. His piece isn't long, and it's not written with a lot of scientific jargon because, as I say, he's more of a political writer. So I want to share it with you. Under the headline, "It's now looking like the lockdowns may have been a huge mistake," appeared over the weekend in the New York Post. Michael Barone. Were lockdowns a mistake? To that nagging question, the answer increasingly seems to be yes. Certainly they were a novelty. As novelist Lionel Shriver writes, "We've never before responded to a contagion by closing down whole countries." As I've noted, the 1957-58 Asian flu killed between 70 and 116,000 Americans, which is between 0.04 and 0.07% of the nation's population. The 1968-70 Hong Kong flu killed about 100,000, which is 0.05% of the population. The U.S. coronavirus death toll of 186,000 is 0.05% of the current population. It will go higher, but it's about the same magnitude as those two flus. And it has been less deadly to those under 65 than the flus were. Yet, there were no statewide lockdowns, no massive school closings, no closings of office buildings and factories, restaurants and museums. No one considered shutting down Woodstock. Now, let me interject. This is me now. I'm off the road. You look back, and it was only 50 years ago. Woodstock occurred during the Hong Kong flu. I was just a kid then. Nothing was shut down in 68, 69, and 7. Nothing. I mean, this is the hippies, San Francisco, drugs, orgies, all this stuff. I mean, baby boomers hanging around on top of one another. I mean, everywhere there was one kid, there'd be 50 kids because there was nowhere to put all of us. We're all in these dense houses because this is the era where moms and dads were still having 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And if you had a Catholic family, 25 kids that were running around. This was the Hong Kong flu era. The Hong Kong flu's numbers, as Barone is pointing out, are very, very similar in terms of percentage of the population to what coronavirus was. And here you got 500,000 people slopping around on top of one another without any bathrooms, taking whizzes in the field and so on. In other words, the point he makes is the approach we took on this is completely different from the approach that we have taken throughout all of human history. I'll pick back up at his column. Why are attitudes so different today? Now, this goes back into one of the things that I was talking about. Perhaps we have greater confidence in government's effectiveness if public policy can affect climate change, it can stamp out a virus. In other words, he's saying if we actually think that our public policy has something to do with what's happened in the climate, maybe we actually are dumb enough to think that public policy can stamp out a virus, despite the fact that that's never happened before. He continues. Plus, we're much more risk averse. I've commented on this. We're a bunch of nervous Nellies now. We're only 75 years removed from the generation that fought World War II and allowed hundreds of thousands of Americans to die. Now we're scared to death of anything. Continuing. Plus, we're much more risk averse. Children aren't allowed to walk to school. Jungle gyms have vanished from playgrounds. College students are shielded from microaggressions. We have a safetyism mindset, as Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff write in The Coddling of the American Mind, under which many aspects of student lives needed to be carefully regulated by adults. So the news of the COVID-19 virus killing dozens and overloading hospitals in Bergamo, Italy, triggered a flight to safety and restriction. Many Americans stopped going to restaurants and shops even before the lockdowns were ordered in March and April. The exaggerated projections of some epidemiologists with a professional interest in forecasting pandemics triggered demands that governments act. Now, let me stop. The point Barone is making there. So many of the epidemiologists who projected these high numbers, well, they have a bias for projecting high numbers. If you're an expert in pandemics, you kind of want there to be a pandemic, right? It's like these people that are storm chasers are the only people in the world that are happy to see a funnel cloud because they want to see the funnel cloud. Back to Barone. The legitimate fears that hospitals would be overwhelmed apparently explain, in retrospect, deadly orders of the governors of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Michigan requiring elderly care facilities to admit COVID-infected patients. And the original purpose to flatten the curve segued into stamp out the virus. Of all the things that we did, can you come up with anything in retrospect that was dumber than requiring the nursing homes to accept COVID patients? Now, why did they do that? Because they were afraid that the hospitals would be overwhelmed, so we didn't want them going to the hospitals. So instead, we put them in the nursing homes and they killed all of their fellow residents. Back to the column. But the apparent success of South Korea and island nations, Taiwan, Singapore, New Zealand, in doing so could never be replicated in the continental globalized United States. Governors imposing continued lockdowns claim to be following the science, but only in one dimension, reducing the immediate number of COVID-19 cases. The lockdowns also prevented cancer screenings, heart attack treatment, and substance abuse counseling, the absence of which resulted in a large but hard to estimate number of deaths. What Haidt and Lukianoff call vindictive protectiveness turned out to be not very protective. Examples include shaming beachgoers, though outdoor virus spread is minimal. Extending school shutdowns, though few children get or transmit the infection. Closing down gardening aisles in superstores, and barring church services while blessing inevitably noisy and crowded demonstrations for politically favored causes. That's my favorite. Restricting attendance at church, but allowing rioters to mass together. Barone continues. The new thinking on lockdowns, as Greg Ip reported in the Wall Street Journal last week, is that they're overly blunt and costly. That supports President Trump's mid-April statement that, quote, a prolonged lockdown combined with a forced economic depression would inflict an immense and wide-ranging toll on public health. For many, that economic damage has been of great depression proportions. Restaurants and small businesses have been closed forever, even before the last 3 months of mostly peaceful urban rioting. He's got mostly peaceful in quotation marks. Losses have been concentrated on those with low income and little wealth, while lockdowns have added tens of billions to the net worth of Amazon's Jeff Bezos and Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg. Interesting point. The winners on the lockdown. The tech companies, the delivery companies, companies like Amazon, companies like Facebook, Their value has gone up during all of this. And again, wonder why some of them supported so many of these lockdowns. They were the beneficiaries. Many small, medium-sized business owners and Americans crushed. Back to Barone. The anti-lockdown blogger and former New York Times reporter Alex Berenson makes a powerful case that lockdowns delayed rather than prevented infections. There are old lessons here. Governments can sometimes channel, but never entirely control nature. There is no way to entirely eliminate risk. Attempts to reduce one risk may increase others. Amid uncertainty, people make mistakes, like maybe the lockdowns. Michael Barone's column saying that the evidence is becoming overwhelming as we look in retrospect that the lockdowns have been a disaster and have done very little good. Now, I will point out that some of us said this from the very beginning. And people like me who objected to these lockdowns making many of the points now, hey, all these things are going to happen that Barone is pointing out have happened. Well, you're not an expert. You're just a talk show host. I can't think of the number of fields in business where somebody that hasn't even gone to college ends up doing way better in business than somebody that's got an MBA and trained and this, that, and the other thing. In the end, having a factual base to start with, as I said, is only part of the equation. You've got to be able to apply it. And apply it requires you to have the ability to make good judgments. One of my favorite terms, I used to use it on the show all the time, is uncommon common sense. Common sense isn't common. If common sense was common, we would not have put up with any of this lockdown crap from the beginning. We would have all been able to see everything that turned out to happen was going to happen. News Talk 1130 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. Here's another thing I say a lot. It's a lot easier to get into things than get out of them. There are certain things that fit that criteria perfectly. Marriage is certainly an example of that. It's a lot easier to get married than to get unmarried. To get married, you really have to do anything, right? What do you have to do to get married? You go to the clerk's office. Isn't that it? No, but I'm just saying to get married. What, you can get married by going to the clerk's office, and I don't even know how long you have to wait anymore, right? You get a license, and then you find somebody who's authorized to do it, which is just about anybody. Try getting out of a marriage. I mean, being of my age, I know lots and lots of people that have been divorced, and almost all of them have been hellish. Not to mention the fact that one person has to leave. You've got the issues with the children, the division of assets, the financial settlement. Sometimes if you have a business involved, the sale of it's just an unbelievable thing. Never mind marriage. How about a relationship? I've been in a few of those. None recently. Very easy to get into them. Yeah, okay. Let's agree not to see that neither of us will see anybody else. That's all you have to do to say you're in a relationship, right? How long did that take? 1.5 seconds? Try getting out of one of those things. So, sometimes, okay, fine, let's just move on. That happens when both people are sick of the other. Usually doesn't work out that way. That's, as I've been pointing out, the problem with these lockdowns. I said this when you started. It's going to be a lot harder to ever get out of this than it is to get into it. Well, it's just like, Evers' mask order supposedly expires September 28th. It won't. We'll extend it, just as this whole lockdown thing. Once you start locking things down and saying you can't go to a restaurant, you can't go to a school, it becomes very, very difficult to ever get out of this lockdown mode because you've established that stopping somebody from getting COVID is the only thing that you've prioritized. There's other examples of this. Try getting rid of a treadmill. I laughed when I got this. Well, I'll never get rid of this. Plus, be a dope and put it in your basement. Well, they got it in, but I had to get the thing out. And the thing's been busted for like 12 years. I mean, it's really stupid to fix a treadmill because it costs about as much to fix the thing as it does to buy, to buy a new one. Well, eventually I got it out of there and it did its final sayonara and it went away in a truck. What do you think the truck said on the side of it as the treadmill went away? It's the easiest question in the world. What did the truck say on the side of it? Well, they never got junked yet. You say, why did you call them? Well, the creation of that company name was marketing brilliance, right? I mean, they dominate the haul-away business in the United States. It's the only franchised one of any real size. There's others that are out there, but yeah, I'm just saying. But with that creation of that name, just who doesn't know the phone number? Who doesn't know the phone number? They came, they hauled away the crap that needed to be hauled away, and the treadmill was one of them. I mean, it was just, you talk about getting out of a bad relationship, watching that treadmill go away, knowing that the next thing it was going to do is it was going to be scrapped out and busted out for parts and melted down. Just happy to see that piece of crap go away. The point I make on all of these things is we can make these decisions to get involved in whatever it is that you get involved in. But most of them are very, very, very hard to get out of. When Wauwatosa made the decision to allow all of its municipal ordinances to be violated by one set of offenders, the protesters, the anti-police protesters, they, I think, thought, well, 2 or 3 days they'll protest. We'll leave it alone. Let's not let that be a bigger deal. Now you're over 100 days in it and there's no end in sight. They don't know how to get out of it. They don't know how to change the policy and suddenly say we're going to start enforcing our ordinance and crack down and say we're not going to allow this uncivil behavior to continue. So that certainly applies to with regard to all the decisions that we've made with regard to the COVID and so on. And a final point before I finally end all of this. When they were building that hospital at State Fair Park, you may recall that I said there'll never be a single COVID patient in that thing. Our hospitals, and they were building that, remember, right during the surge in April. Through the surge. And we were never close to capacity in any of our hospitals. Not even close. Virtually nobody other than me stood up and said, stop building this. No contracts were let. The contractor got their money. But we would have been better off just paying them off to leave the thing half done. Well, but the experts say, the experts say, the experts say. If we can learn from this, can we learn from the following? Virtually everyone who considers him or herself to be a public health expert in the United States has proven that they don't know one damn thing. Can we at least learn that? Every now and then you'll see a coach and basketball coaches. You can fail, like, it's amazing. Sometimes you can fail in 2 jobs and still get a 3rd job. And you wonder, well, why would anybody hire that guy? He failed in the other 2 places. Sometimes you get a Bill Belichick, the first job, it just didn't work out and they were worth a second chance. But after like 3 or 4 times, you think kind of, maybe this person doesn't know what it is that they're doing. You do wonder. If we have a public health issue, a new one that comes up, say, in early 2022, and all the public health experts say that we should do such and such, are we just going to immediately bend over backwards and again assume they know what they're doing? As I say, this was a top-down managed thing, and I think the head quack in the United States is Fauci. You all know what I think of him. Fauci is a guy who's 45% of his essence is controlled by China with the entanglements that he's had. He's also an institutionalist who's tight with the drug companies and tight with the vaccine operations and so on. So he's got a bias. But his bias wasn't the problem. The fact that Fauci was wrong from the beginning isn't the problem. The problem is that nobody stood up to him in 50 states. Okay, Cuomo decides to butcher everything in New York by saying that we're going to put the nursing homes have to accept COVID patients. Why did the governor of New Jersey have to do the same thing? You see my drift here. Just because Waukesha calls off its county fair, why does Ozaki have to call it off? And why does Washington? Well, nobody wants to buck up against the tide, even if the tide appears to be terribly misevaluated. Lengthy subject, but I think I've made the point about the deference that we show to experts, which is bad enough if the experts don't know what they're doing, but is a disaster when the field of experts that we're talking about is overwhelmingly dominated by radical liberals. You get a public education system that's producing, where are we ranked? About 28th in the world right now, even though we spend more money. The public health response have gotten just about everything that you want to take a look at. That's overwhelmingly dominated by liberals stinks. What do you think professional sports are doing to themselves right now? Again, overwhelmingly dominated by liberals making decisions. Does anybody think in 5 to 10 years the NBA will be healthier than it is today? I don't. What about the NFL, which starts its season this weekend? Does anybody think that the NFL is still growing? I don't. Yet you allow people to shove their elbows around, make decisions that you know are stupid. Standing up for Milwaukee, this is the Mark Billing Late Afternoon Show on News Talk 1130 WISN. One of the things that liberals are very good at is finding an excuse to do the things that they wanted to do all along. In the case of police shootings of African Americans, they have tried to do all sorts of things they wanted to do all along and have used the police shootings of African Americans as the cover to do this. Now, we can debate forever what the state of race relations in the United States is. What is undebatable, however, is that the people who support the Black Lives Matter movement show no real interest in black lives other than those that are taken by police officers. We're in the middle of one of the greatest surges of violent crime from year to year in American history. And Milwaukee is one of the cities that has seen the largest increase in the murder rate, particularly of African Americans. And it, of course, has nothing to do with police officers. There has been very little concern about that. Many people have been holding signs saying, unborn Black Lives Matter. More African American children are aborted than white or Latino children. Yet there's been no particular concern about that. So is there a serious, real, deep-seated hang-up over the rare case of an African American shot by a police officer and the even rarer case of an African American who was not resisting being shot by a police officer? Or is it simply an opportunity that many are using to get done a lot of things that they wanted to do all along? Like putting an anti-American agenda in the curriculum of public schools all over the country. A fair amount of attention was given last week to a story from Burlington. Burlington is a very conservative community. Some parents there found out that a fourth grade teacher had inserted Black Lives Matter material into the curriculum. When I say Black Lives Matter, I mean this is from the actual organization Black Lives Matter, which is a radical Marxist organization. School superintendent said, well, it wasn't approved material, and I guess we shouldn't be doing that. It's now been learned that the same teacher has participated in Black Lives Matter protests, including one targeting a Burlington business owner because he wouldn't put a sign up in his store. Now, this has been happening all over the United States. People will go to a retailer or a restaurant and say, put a Black Lives Matter sign in your window, and if you don't, we're going to protest in front of your place. It's just blackmail. This teacher was one of those demonstrating in front of, and I'm not going to name the business owner, I'm not going to bring any more hell to that particular business, but they wouldn't put the Black Lives Matter sign in their store, and the same teacher is protesting in front of the store. That's bullying and goon-like behavior. Trying to tell somebody else that they have to take the political stance that you want to take. And that just happens to be the same person who inserted this radical material into the school curriculum. If someone from the right did this and inserted inappropriate material with a political bias, but from the conservative perspective in a curriculum, and then harassed a law-abiding citizen because that citizen wasn't behaving conservatively, one can't imagine that the school board or superintendent of the community would have tolerated it. But Burlington School Board, which is liberal, and the school superintendent have made the decision to do nothing about the behavior of this teacher. Now, let's move to Kettle Moraine. Remember the premise that I used to establish this topic. You take a problem and use it as the opportunity to do something that you've wanted to do all along. Anybody who knows anything about kids knows that they all love Snap. Snap or Snapchat is a social media app that a lot of young people like because they think it gives them the ability to say things that you can't nail them for. The problem with that is that I don't think anything's ever been invented in cyberspace that doesn't leave a footprint somewhere. There was apparently a very racist post that was sent out on Snapchat and seen by a number of kids in the Kettle Moraine school district. This is hardly surprising. I can't imagine something that wouldn't have offended virtually every group that's not been put on some sort of Snapchat post. That's what kids do on social media. They say things that are offensive. This kid is this one is that. They throw around opinions. They throw around all sorts of things that would probably make, most of it is probably very, very hard to defend, but that's what young people are going to do with these types of posts. We also know that we have people publicly standing out in the streets, screaming in the face of a police officer, saying F the police and saying every possible bad thing that you can imagine, and nothing is ever done to them. But in Kettle Moraine, where this racist post apparently circulated on Snapchat, there's been a response from the school superintendent of the school district, and of course, they're going to use this as an opportunity to put a lot of ideology in the Kettle Moraine curriculum. In other words, the old Rahm Emanuel statement, never let a good crisis go to waste. Okay, we've got a problem here. This post is out there. Let's do something we've wanted to do all along. Do some lefty ideologizing in the curriculum. The one, of course, doesn't have anything to do with the other than, in this case, the superintendent, Pat DeClotz, and the school board decide this is our opportunity to jump and A, virtue signal because we're so racially aware, and B, let's make our curriculum even more lefty. Now, the following was sent out over the weekend by Pat DeClotz, who is the superintendent of the Kettle Moraine district. I'll read it all. Dear parents and guardians, in late evening on September 3rd of 2020, a Kettle Moraine High School administrator became aware of an offensive and inappropriate racist social media post between students and immediately began to investigate. Once all of the facts surrounding the matter were clear, the district took prompt action to address it and also referred the matter to law enforcement. As a reminder, the district does not make public the specific consequences that result from violations of policy and behavior expectations. The incident has gained attention and outrage on social media, and we now have the opportunity, they admit, we have the opportunity to engage in a larger conversation about an issue that is gripping our nation. Systemic racism. Notice how quickly we have just moved into that just being a given that it exists. Systemic racism, as opposed to individual racism, which undeniably exists. Systemic racism and implicit bias. Again, an idea that a few months ago would have been controversial, but is now just a given. Systemic racism and implicit bias are concerns within our society, and yes, they are also concerns within our schools. Our past and present students of color have told us that they experience microaggressions and racist comments within our halls and classrooms. I'm guessing Christian children probably could say the same thing. As a district, we have taken steps and increased our attention to these issues over the past several years. We have district and school-wide teams developing expectations and opportunities for students to learn of diversity and cultures beyond their own. We are examining instructional materials to include multiple and diverse perspectives. I love that. Multiple and diverse perspectives. In other words, say a pro-American perspective or simply a neutral perspective. That isn't going to exist. Nope. Valuing cultures that differ from the predominant view. What does that mean? Are all views again equal? Evidently so. And which cultures are the ones? I doubt that the Nazi culture, for example, is going to be worked into this thing, because it shouldn't be. But there are going to be cultures that are chosen selectively, and others, of course, will not be. This is what happens when you have a political ideology that you use to pollute a curriculum that ought to be neutral in the first place. Back to DeClotz's letter. The Superintendent's Advisory on Cultural Proficiency, composed of parents and students of marginalized groups, seeks to give a platform to those voices not often heard. Yet, what we have done is not sufficient. So despite the fact they've done all this, there's going to be more out there in Kettle Moraine. We realize that we cannot accomplish this work in and of ourselves. We ask you as parents in our community to join us in our efforts to help ensure that our students of color enjoy a safe learning environment and support from their classmates. We need your active participation and support. Embrace and support our students and families of color, those from different cultures, ethnicities, races, and religions. Support of our teachers as they include culturally relevant materials. Culturally relevant materials. These are all, by the way, code words and buzzwords. They don't seem objectionable in and of themselves until you see the crap that gets handed down in the name of being, what was the term here? Culturally relevant materials. I don't think that this is going to be a biography of Donald Trump, and discuss misunderstandings of slavery and historical oppression. I swear, who misunderstands slavery? Do you misunderstand slavery? I think I understand slavery. I think I understand exactly what happened in the United States. I don't believe that there's any misunderstanding of it. Engage your children in conversations about the strength that comes from differences and educate yourselves on the issues that our country is facing. Seek to understand why people of color are angry. Educate yourself on facts not likely included in your educational experience with traditional texts of American history. By the way, this screen from DeClotz in and of itself is racist. Are all people of color angry? I think a lot of people of color are angry about the rioting that is going on. Polls have shown that the majority of people of color do not want to have the police defunded. This presumption, again, that we're going to have a bunch of people that are going to tell you how all black people think is as condescending as any racist screed that any white supremacist could ever put out. It's the determination that when we talk about other cultures, we can lump people together and consider them all to be the same because they are of this particular religion or this particular race or this particular gender or this particular ethnicity. We use the umbrella of hashtag KMKInd, in other words, KM kind, to speak to students in raising their awareness of bias and prejudice. But the work we have to do goes far beyond the one hashtag. As a district, we take the issue of equity and developing cultural proficiency in and among our students very seriously. We are committed to the ongoing work that is needed, and I ask that you join with us for the good of the students we serve and the communities in which we live. Another thing that strikes me about about this letter from Pat DeClatz. It's extraordinary that they had this all raring to go in just the 3 days since this Snapchat post came out. You see the point that I make. They were waiting for some kids to do something obnoxious, whatever it was in that post, so they could roll out the thing that they wanted to do all along, which is pollute their curriculum with a bunch of ideologically driven material. If this was simply respect all races, respect all cultures, we need to be a colorblind society, stop showing cruelty toward one another, and so on, no one would object to that. But it never turns out to be that. It instead turns out to be the kind of liberal glop that horrifies people when it shows up in our curriculums. That America is a terribly racist nation. That capitalism in and of itself is racist. And on and on and on you go. And the next thing you know, Christianity is terrible. The missionaries who came over and provided tremendous assistance for people that they came to see here in our culture were simply invaders, etc. In other words, you use the platitudes to go out and do again what you intended to do all along, which is to pollute your educational curriculum with a bunch of liberalism. And they take advantage of this Snapchat post to do so. Do you think any students of color have put out racist things directed at what? I'm guessing they have. I'm guessing just about every kid that's involved in social media has done some awful thing at one point or another. It's only jumped on, however, when people are looking to do something that they've wanted to do all along. I'm guessing the post did occur, and I'm guessing that the post is probably rather offensive. And I'm guessing that probably posts like this have been done forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. But it is only now that Pat DeClatz wants to, at Kettle Moraine, take this as an opportunity to probably do what she's intended to do all along, which is to eliminate any positive view of Western civilization and take the academic curriculum at Kettle Moraine and fill it with a bunch of liberal tripe. As I say, if this stopped at non-controversial ideas about racial equity, not being a biased individual, loving one another, and so on, that would have the support of everyone. It never does. Once this stuff actually comes down, it becomes the sort of thing that happened in Burlington, where some Marxist screed from Black Lives Matter gets inserted into the curriculum by a fourth grade teacher. News Talk 1130 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. Now, before I completely depart the topic, whenever people say that they want to have a conversation about race, they don't want to have a conversation about race. They want to have a monologue about race. People who have a conversation and offer a point of view that dissents from the politically accepted point of view are considered to be racist and are fired. Northwestern Mutual got rid of an employee because of a post that she made critical of some of the things that happened in Kenosha. That just happened. If you work at an American company and you make a social media post that the bosses don't like and it deals with the issue of race, try arguing that what you said is not racist. It becomes a losing proposition. There is no desire for conversation at all. What I have attacked is the premise that somehow we have some sort of terrible problem in the United States of white police officers killing innocent African-American suspects. It is still a relatively rare phenomenon. The vast majority of cases are cases in which the officer is cleared because it was overwhelmingly obvious that the shooting by the police officer was justified. Here in Wisconsin, the most controversial police shooting that we've had to deal with was involving an African-American officer who shot an African-American, where race obviously is an irrelevant component of the story. We are jumping on this, however, to turn this into this larger issue of dealing with our supposedly racist society. If we were an inherently racist society, you could prove it by murder rates. There would be more whites murdering blacks than blacks murdering whites in the United States. That would be a statistic that you could point to as evidence of us being a racist nation. Except that stat doesn't exist. In the United States of America, we do not have more blacks killed by whites than the other way around. It doesn't happen. The reason it doesn't happen is we have a crime rate in which violent crime, by a percentage, occurs at a higher level in the African American community and the white community. That isn't because of racism on anybody's part. It's because of all of the other problems that we've cited with regard to the high violent crime rate that has plagued the African American community. But an example of racism would be if you had white people all over the United States just killing black people for no reason. That would be racist. But that phenomenon does not exist. When there is an interracial murder, we have more cases in our country of a black person shooting and killing a white person than vice versa. To turn that around and suddenly argue that that means that all blacks are racist would be ridiculous. But we have extrapolated the rare police shooting and turning it into some sort of systemic racism that exists in our nation. And as I say, in Wisconsin, the example that they keep citing is Wauwatosa, where there is no racial component at all, given the fact that the police officer himself is African American. What we like to do is take these facts and jump to the conclusions that we want to draw anyway. Now, this one's interesting. I have a listener commenting, passes this along to me, and I want to expand on it. She writes, just when I thought the election cycle could not get any worse, I just heard the Democratic vice presidential candidate just said she was proud of a rapist. Well, he's accused of sexual assault, not necessarily rape, but when you look at the number of comments that people have made over the last several days about Jacob Blake, you would think that like no one knew that this is a guy who is accused of third-degree sexual assault. He is accused of sexually assaulting a woman and then stealing her stuff and running off. When did the left suddenly become supportive of sexual assaulters? Now you get, well, we don't know if he did it. He's only accused. Well, you could certainly say that about most of the police. You could say that about the police officer, Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, who is accused of killing George Floyd by kneeing him on the throat. You would think it would be possible. You would think, but it clearly isn't possible for people to object to the killing of Jacob Blake without turning Jacob Blake into a good person. Oh, he's doing the interview from the hospital bed and so on. He is accused of sexual assault. That doesn't, one way or another, mean that the actions of the police officer in Kenosha were justified or not. Whether someone is guilty of a separate crime or not, police should not, indefensibly, without defense, shoot a suspect. And whether or not that was a bad shooting or not in Kenosha is still to be determined. It's still being investigated. But we should be able to discuss this story without turning Jacob Blake into a saint. It's another story of shades of gray. Was Jacob Blake someone who was resisting to the point by which the officer was justified in using lethal force? I think the case can be made that the answer is yes. It's also possible that the case can be made that the answer is no. The thing that's so difficult about the whole thing is he's obscured by the car door when he's shot. It makes it very hard to make a proper judgment about whether or not the police officer was justified. But we also know that he was a guy who was exhibiting remarkable levels of being out of control, given the fact that 2 separate tase shots were put on him and he did not come down. We also know that he was trying to get into a car with 3 children and it was not his own car. Mitigating circumstances. But none of them determined clearly whether or not the shooting was justified or not. In other words, people are going to have their opinions. But whatever your opinion is shouldn't change the fact that Jacob Blake is a guy that's accused of sexual assault. So therefore, stop trying to nominate him for sainthood. It's remarkable to me that Kamala Harris can be so brazen that she was the leader of this. She condemned Brett Kavanaugh on an allegation of inappropriate sexual contact pressure 35, 40 years ago when he was pushing high school into college without any proof that it ever happened and judging him decades later. And the same Kamala Harris is just ignoring the fact that only 2 months ago, Jacob Blake is actually accused of a sexual assault. There's a term called compartmentalizing. Saw an interview once, I don't remember where I saw it, but Michael Chiklis from The Shield was on there. Shield is one of the greatest TV shows of all time. It's one of the first shows that it was good guys are bad, bad guys are good, but bad guys are also good guys, and so on. It was about very flawed police precinct. And Michael Chiklis played a guy named Vic Mackey, the cop, probably the dirtiest cop in the history of America, but somehow it always seemed like his dirtiness could be justified. And Michael Chiklis was doing this interview in which he said, the show was all about compartmentalizing, that you could show just how terrible Vic Mackey was, but also show in a different context that everything that he was doing was justified, that you could somehow compartmentalize and see the one in terms of the other. The compartmentalization that liberals are capable of is, to me, extraordinary. Without regard to whether or not Jacob Blake's shooting was wrong or not, you don't have to turn Jacob Blake into a saint. You don't have to do that. But the left and the media have felt the need to take somebody who is, by all indications, a bad guy and turn him into a wonderful person just because he was on the receiving end of a shooting that many people want to criticize. What if Jacob Blake is somebody that was wanted for 11 murders? It still doesn't mean a cop can just gun him down for any reason. But you would think that we would then show enough restraint to not nominate the person for some sort of incredible valor. The fact of the matter is that we generally set up our laws to protect people who are less than perfect human beings. This story, though, and the need for so many people to turn it into a narrative, incredibly proud, innocent person gunned down by monstrous cop. You can have any take you want to have on the Jacob Blake shooting, but you don't get the right to redefine the individuals that are involved and create your own terms on it, even though it may make it more comfortable for you to deal with it that way. Whether Blake was guilty of that sexual assault from July or not shouldn't affect whether or not the officer should have used lethal force or not. Likewise, whether he's guilty of it or not shouldn't affect the decision by local television stations to pretend that that criminal charge and that incident didn't occur. And for the vice president, a candidate trying to be vice president of the United States, to be saying she's proud of a man who's facing felony sexual assault charges, that's a warped world. News Talk 1130 WISN. Mark Belling, late afternoon show. I planted a seed at the beginning of the program, and we're going to try to grow that into a tree coming up after the news break that we're going to roll into. On the notion of Jacob Blake and how the story has been characterized, which has been the subject of the last two segments of the program, I go back to what I was talking about in the first hour of the show, how we want to believe something and we end up feeling the need to manipulate facts in order to get us to the conclusion that we want to draw. I don't know if Jacob Blake is a rapist or not. We do know that the victim was known to him. And often, those are the kinds of cases in which consent becomes something that has to be debated often at trial. He was accused of breaking into a woman's house. He knew the woman and having sexual intercourse with her against her consent. That's what he had the open warrant for at the time, that now 2 months later he was in Kenosha trying to get away from the authorities. The third-degree sexual assault count in Wisconsin is what is used for sexual intercourse without threat of violence. In other words, there wasn't a weapon or there wasn't an implied threat of violence. It's the sort of charge that is brought forward when someone has sexual assault with someone else against their will, but there was not an implied threat of violence. It's often the charge that comes out in date rape kinds of situations. Sexual intercourse against someone's will, however, is rape. That's what he's charged with. Again, in situations like this where the victim is known to the individual, often there are two sides of the story, as we all know. And I haven't heard anybody's side of the story in this particular case. We do know that Blake had been wanted with an open warrant for that. But he is certainly an accused rapist. That's what he is. And I think before people start putting forward him as this wonderful, incredible human being, we ought to factor that part in. You can draw whatever conclusion you want to draw about the shooting. But you don't get the right to just take an eraser to facts that we have out there, including the fact that this charge is out there on him. It just makes it more difficult, I guess, for some people to object to the shooting if the victim might be somebody who is a bad person. Whereas, as we all know, that shouldn't have anything to do with the shooting itself. I look at it this way. You're in the emergency room in a hospital and somebody comes in a gurney and they've got a gunshot wound. It's not the job of the healthcare providers to decide if this is a good person or a bad person. They have to save their life. Maybe he has a gunshot because he shot first at somebody and somebody shot back. Who knows? You make the determination to try to save the person's life. And police officers certainly have to understand that sometimes they're dealing with good people or bad people. Because you have a bad guy in front of you doesn't mean that you can just start executing him. Not that I'm suggesting that that's what occurred here. As I say, you can make a pretty strong case based on what we know now that the shooting may have been justified, just as you can make a strong case that they shot the guy in the back and he could have tried to drag him out of the car before he did that. Tough call, given that we haven't seen what we saw. What I object to is the almost omission from all of these stories, and certainly by political commentators on the left, of the fact that the reason that the guy was wanted in the first place is because he was wanted for a sexual assault, a rape. It's part of the story. And it's part of our understanding and evaluating of Blake. And again, acknowledge that he has not been convicted of this. And it's possible that the allegation is simply untrue. Some of the hardest and most difficult cases to deal with in our society are cases of date rape or acquaintance rape or sexually assaulting someone that you know. Is the allegation true? Is it not true? Well, we do know that long before this incident ever occurred in Kenosha, the district attorney's office in Kenosha County brought that criminal charge against him. Next time I see one of these TVs say, oh, we got him in the bed and isn't it wonderful? I'm glad he's smiling and all that. You're saying this about a guy who was accused of rape. Do understand that. Standing up for Milwaukee, this is the Mark Belling Late Afternoon Show on News Talk 1130 WISN. As you know, I don't know what's going on with the stock market. I've wondered whether or not we're finally getting rotation. In other words, the tech stocks that have been soaring for so long are going to go in the tank for a year and a half. And these guys that keep going on, at some point the value stocks are going to come back. They're more compelling value than ever. Maybe they're finally getting their day in. Some of the more established companies that have these low price earnings ratios that are considered to be strong value but are not in sexy industries, maybe it's their time. I mean, these small cap value stocks have been in the dumper for about 4 years as the tech stocks have done nothing but go up and perhaps got to the point in which their valuations were literally insane. The Tesla story is the one, of course, that everybody's talked about, and Tesla over the last 3 days has had its stock just crater. Now, if you bought Tesla a year ago, what do you care? If you're one of those people who bought it, okay, I think I'm going to get it in Tesla. It's up 18 billion % in the last 9 months. You probably, I don't know what's it down from the peak already, 25 and 30%. Some ridiculous number that it's pulled back from, but stock market. Anyway, I want to do a segment here that's going to require two parts. I want to start with this. This piece appeared over the weekend in the Federalist. The reporter involved went to the Trump rally several days ago in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Latrobe, Pennsylvania is known for a couple of things. I only knew it for one thing. Do you know what Latrobe, Pennsylvania is known for? You might be a little bit too young to know it. Hometown of one of the most famous athletes in American history, Arnold Palmer. See, you did know it. The reason is noted back in the day when they'd have, you don't do it anymore, when they put the Gulf scores in the newspaper and the agate, they'd put their hometown. I mean, that hasn't been done forever and ever and ever, but they used to refer to, Sam Snead from wherever in North Carolina and Jack Nicklaus from such and such. Nobody ever says it. They just say the country anymore, but that's how Arnold Palmer in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, I just remember as a kid, you'd always see Arnold Palmer, Latrobe, Pennsylvania, Gary Player somewhere in South Africa, and so on. I want to quote the story because the reporter is just stunned by the size of the Trump crowd and how joyful people were. It's not like the old rallies because people are still largely in cars, but you need to hear this story in order to hear the segment that comes after it. He writes, there are 3 roads to Arnold Palmer Regional Airport. The traffic jam stretches 1.5 miles into Unity Township, out a mile toward the country club, and 8 miles toward Pittsburgh. He's describing a 10-mile traffic jam. Parking by a mailbox and hoping we don't get towed, we hustle past as the red flag waving line of packed cars, trucks, station wagons, and occasional motorcycles creep slowly onward toward that evening's festivities. The county paper predicted a crowd of 2,000 plus for President Donald Trump's 7 p.m. hangar stop. There are more than twice that many vehicles in the parking lots and fields by 4, with some camping out overnight and miles more on their way, slowly passing the Trump signs that decorate every other yard. The president won this state by a paper-thin 44,000 votes 4 years ago, and polls show a razor-tight race. Rolling Rock drinkers might recognize the town of Latrobe from the cold green bottles they knock back. See, that one I didn't know. I didn't know Rolling Rock was from Latrobe. Did you? You barely had the Palmer thing. First you said you didn't know, and then you said Palmer right away. Your mind is like on a tape delay or something. Yeah, you got it. You always, but no. And then all of a sudden you knew. Don't be so quick to say that no. Just pause, think it through rather than... That's why I always say I think you know it, because you underestimate. You're smarter than you think. You're not the very smart. Should I finish the thing? Latrobe Brewing had called the city home since 1939 and left generations of employees behind for the few hard years ahead. Every bar had Rolling Rock on tap, the bartender at Touchdown Club tells us. Everybody boycotted it. Just this year, people started drinking it again. It's because Rolling Rock pulled out. Stacy Molina, a young-looking 36, tends bar at the club. Founded in 1947, it was private for years, and the handwritten membership cards of Steelers legends Terry Bradshaw, founder Art Rooney, owner Art Rooney II, and hometown hero Mr. Rogers are framed on the wall. The town has hosted football teams for 125 years, and the Steelers training camp is just by the airport. The old-timers enjoyed old-time steakhouse cocktails like the Grasshopper until the last one passed just a few weeks before our visit. If you sit in one of our seats, they just stand there and look at you until you moved, Stacy laughs. I ordered long neck Rolling Rock after assurances I wouldn't upset any of the mid-afternoon drinkers. Young and old, men and women, politicos and locals are packing in as we make the near-mile trek from the roadside gravel we hope won't cause any trouble to a parking spot for the evening. You'll hear about the festival atmosphere from corporate reporters at Black Lives Matter riots as arson smoke drifts past the cameras. But for years, Trump rallies have been more like a big classic rock or country music concert, complete with a tailgating feel, laughter, broad smiles, and a presidential soundtrack ranging from Guns N' Roses to Celine Dion. It's a laugh reading intrepid reporters' accounts of the hostile mobs they claim to face at these events, when the reality is far closer to the harmless cheers and boos of a medieval fair's jousting match. There will be thousands who sit in traffic for hours just to get somewhere nearby. But the only frown is on the face of a driver stuck for a moment in the muddy grass of his makeshift parking spot. A helicopter drifts nearby, and Phil Collins' In the Air Tonight begins as the loudspeaker announces Air Force One's imminent arrival to booming cheers, the playlist shifting to Eye of the Tiger as the national plane pulls by. Tears stream down the faces of two older women in the crowd. "I'm just so excited," one exclaims, embarrassed, while a third friend chuckles and pats her on the back. Emerging from the iconic presidential backdrop to cheers, applause, and chants of USA, the president launches right into it, praising my late great friend Arnold Palmer and promising the crowd, "I will keep your jobs in America, and I will bring violent looters, rioters, anarchists. I will bring them to justice. We have more than 400 of them under arrest. These are bad people," he continues, listing administration accomplishments from defeating ISIS to tackling the China virus. "Now we have to get back to work," he promises, counting the 61 days until we win Pennsylvania. "We don't have a lot of farmers in the crowd," he says, moving off a quick riff on trade. "We have Boilermakers. We have a lot of Boilermakers in the crowds. You don't mess with those guys," he chuckles as fists rise in back stands to the right, filled with men and families from Pittsburgh's Local 154, whose endorsement the president earned. "Those are tough guys." I watched Nancy Pelosi say, "You must wear your mask. You have to wear your mask. And we're going to keep every beauty salon closed in California all across the country," he begins an hour in, launching into a comedy bit with his mock impersonation of the speaker. And then I see a picture. I say, "Where's her mask?" And I'll tell you what, she must have treated that beauty salon owner very badly. She uses the salon, and the salon turned her in. "The salon turned her in," he continues to the rising laughter. "And I don't think I would have turned her in. I think I would have said, well, you know, she's a customer. I got to take care of my customers, right? How much do they hate Nancy Pelosi?" She said, "I was set up," he adds a few minutes later. "I want the salon owner to be leading the House of Representatives. Nancy, you're not supposed to get set up. You're leading our country." She's a highly overrated person. They give her such good play. She's a highly overrated person. "Look, they just turned off a camera," he says, pointing toward the press stands amid roaring boos and laughing thumbs down, "because they don't want me saying that." Night has now fallen as the 90-minute nonstop, no warm-up of the evening comes to a close, and the president turns back to his prepared remarks, lifting the crowd one last time with a rousing closer. "This is the Commonwealth where our Union was saved by the heroes at Gettysburg, and where generations of tough, strong workers mined the coal, worked the railroad, forged the steel that made America into the greatest, most powerful nation in the world. Proud citizens like you helped build this country, and together we are taking back our country from these very, very deranged people. We are returning power to you, the American people, with your help and your devotion and your drive. We are going to keep on working. We are going to keep on fighting. We are going to keep on winning, winning, winning. We are one movement, one people, one family, and one glorious nation under God. America will soon be thriving like never before. Next year will be the greatest economic year in the history of our country, and together we will work very, very hard. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America strong again. We will make America proud again, and we will make America great again." His fans line up to buy. "I'll have the red MAGA one, the blue one, and the USA one." And folks help elderly relatives with an arm or a clearer path to walk. The crowds empty into the evening. Outside, the fortitude among the thousands of overflow viewers cheer and exchange slogans with the luckiest ones in the hangar. "I didn't see any counter-protesters," a woman says to her husband as they make their way back to the parking lot. It's a full moon as we roll through the hills back toward the mountainside highway. It's been a lively night in Latrobe, and some fans will be heading to the bars, but most will be headed back home. The kids are getting tired, and tomorrow is still a work day. That's Christopher Bedford's piece in the Federalist, and I thought it was a very good first-hand examination of what it's like right now to be at a Trump rally, the level of passion and the connection that he makes. You needed to hear this before we move into the next segment. Because as deep and passionate as Trump's support is, the hatred of him is equally as visceral. I'm going to be sharing with you a piece, not by a crackpot, not by a quack, but by a prominent conservative figure who's affiliated with the Claremont Institute, which is a major conservative think tank. He's raising the open possibility that the left is planning to do literally anything to stop Trump from winning, right up to and including a coup. Now, when people start saying stuff like this, I usually roll my eyes. This is still America, right? Look at everything that's happened this year. This would only be necessary if Trump so deeply threatened some of the highly powerful elites that thought that they ran our country. Because prior to Trump, I don't even think Reagan had this kind of connection with his supporters. We have seen so many things happen this year that we would have thought never would have happened. But it's a year that started with the strongest economy in American history. And I think the overwhelming likelihood that Trump was going to win. How far will they go? I started the program today by saying I was planting a seed. The seed was the statement that Hillary Clinton made to Joe Biden, which she said he should not under any circumstances concede. Any circumstances. Trump's got 390 electoral votes. Any circumstances. I want you to stick around and hear the next segment. The high temperature in Denver, Colorado, Sunday was 93. It is snowing like crazy this afternoon. Today's high in Denver was 36. That's a 57-degree change in the high temperature, and most of Colorado is getting whomped with snow right now. I mentioned this piece. It's written by a guy named Michael Barone. He's at the Claremont Institute. He's not a crackpot. He's affiliated with Hillsdale College. He's one of those guys who writes essays in the conservative think tanks. He's simply commenting on the number of remarkably odd things that have been stated just over the last several weeks by military leaders, some Democrats. And he's raising in this piece the open possibility that the Democrats and the military will try to force Donald Trump to leave office after the election. I'll share the piece with you. Under the headline, "The Coming Coup, Democrats are laying the groundwork for revolution right in front of our eyes," he writes, "As if 2020 were not insane enough already. We now have Democrats and their ruling class masters openly talking about staging a coup. You might have missed it, what with the riots, lockdowns, and other daily mayhem we're forced to endure in this, the most wretched year of my lifetime, but it's happening. It started with the military brass quietly indicating that the troops should not follow a presidential order. They were bolstered by many former generals, including President Trump's own first Secretary of Defense, who stated openly what the brass would only hint at. Then, as nationwide riots really got rolling in early June, the sitting Secretary of Defense himself all but publicly told the president not to invoke the Insurrection Act. His implicit message was, "Mr. President, don't tell us to do that because we won't." And you know what happens after that? All this enthused Joe Biden, who threw subtlety to the winds. The former United States Senator for 26 years and Vice President for 8, has not once, not twice, but 3 times confidently asserted that, quote, "the military will escort Trump from the White House with great dispatch should the president refuse to leave." Another former Vice President, Al Gore, publicly agreed. One might dismiss such comments as the ravings of a dementia patient and a has-been who never got over his electoral loss. But before you do, consider also this. Over the summer, a story was deliberately leaked to the press of a meeting at which 100 Democratic grandees, anti-Trump former Republicans, and other ruling class apparatchiks got together on George Soros's dime to, quote, game out various outcomes of the 2020 election. One such outcome was a clear Trump win. In that eventuality, former Bill Clinton White House Chief of Staff John Podesta played Biden, refusing to concede, pressured states that Trump won to send Democrats to the formal electoral college vote, and trusted that the military would take care of the rest. The leaked report from the exercise darkly concluded that, quote, technocratic solutions, courts, and reliance on elites observing norms are not the answer here, promising that what would follow the November election would be a street fight, not a legal battle. Two more data points, among several others that could be provided. Over the summer, two former Army officials, both prominent in the Democrat-aligned national security think tank world, wrote an open letter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in which they urged him to deploy the 82nd Airborne Division to drag President Trump from the Oval Office at precisely 12:01 p.m. January 20th, 2021. About a month later, Hillary Clinton declared publicly that Joe Biden should not concede the election under any circumstances. The Old English major in me interpreted the word any to mean no, none, nada, niente, zero, zilch, bupkis. You get the idea. This doesn't sound like the rhetoric of a political party confident it will win an upcoming election. All right, now I'm going to interject. Anton is laying the case that Democrats and people in the establishment have already kind of leaked out that this is the strategy that they're going to employ if Trump wins. Why else do you keep raising this notion of forcing the military to escort him out of office, etc.? The piece continues. These items are, to repeat, merely a short but representative list of what Byron York recently labeled coup porn. York seems to think that this is just harmless fantasizing on the part of the ruling class and its Democratic servants. For some of them, no doubt that's true. But for all of them, I'm not so sure. In his famously exhaustive discussion of conspiracies, Machiavelli goes out of his way to emphasize the indispensability of operational security, i.e. silence to success. The first rule of conspiracy is, you do not talk about conspiracy. The second rule of conspiracy is, you do not talk about the conspiracy. So why are the Democrats publicly talking about the conspiracy? Because they know that for it to succeed, it must not look like a conspiracy. They need to plant the idea in the public mind now that their unlawful and illegitimate removal of President Trump from office will somehow be his fault. Never mind the pesky detail that the president would refuse to leave only if he were convinced that he legitimately won. Remember, Biden should not concede under any circumstance. The second part of the plan is either to produce enough harvested ballots, lawfully or not, to tip close states, or else dispute the results in close states and insist, no matter what the tally says, that Biden won them. Now, let me interject. They had a dry run of that in Florida in 2000. It was only the one state, but every single count that they had Bush winning, yet if they said Biden, I meant Gore, that back in 2000, they kept claiming and tried to fight in the courts and claiming that Gore won, even though every time they counted, Bush had won. What is being suggested in this piece is that this could be done in multiple states and simply argue, even if Trump is carrying the tally, that simply, no, he didn't win. Biden won. Back to the piece. The worst case scenario for the country, but not the ruling class, would be results in a handful of states that are so ambiguous and hotly disputed that no one can rightly say who won. Of course, that will not stop the Democrats from insisting that they won. The public preparation for that has already begun. Streams of stories and social media posts, quote, explaining how, while on election night it might look as if Trump won, Closed states will tip to Biden as the mail-in ballots are, quote, counted. The third piece is to get the vast and loud Dem-left propaganda machine ready for war. That leaked report exhorted Democrats to identify key influencers in the media and among local activists who can affect political perceptions and mobilize political action, who could establish pre-commitment to playing a constructive role in the event of a contested election, i.e., in blaring from every rooftop that Trump lost. At this point, it's safe to assume that unless Trump wins in a blowout that can't be overcome by cheating and or denied via the ruling class's massive propaganda operation, that's exactly what every Democratic politician and media organ will shout. He's making the point. If the election is close, even if Trump has won, they're going to claim that Biden won. That's the point that he's making in this piece that Anton is alleging. That they're going to claim, no, we won, this count is off, and you got to count these ballots, and these are still coming in, and this box came in from here, and so on. We won. In other words, keep saying it. And he's arguing that they are going to push this as their tactic, even if, in fact, the raw vote count shows Trump winning. Anton's piece continues. So what then? The Podesta assumption is that the military will side with the Democrats. There are reasons to fear that they might. The Obama administration spent a great deal of political capital purging the officer corps of anyone not down with the program and promoting only those who are. Let me interject. This bogus story planted in the Atlantic over the last several days, clearly coming from military leaders claiming that Trump made these disparaging comments about the military. 2 years later, suddenly they're launched out there now. Denied as they are by even people who don't like Trump, like John Bolton. Again, it would imply that the top leadership of the military is anti-Trump, because the top leadership of the military were the people that were promoted from within during the 8 years of Obama. Back to the piece. Still at all, determining the outcome of the election would be the most open political interference possible from our allegedly apolitical military, and it's plausible that the brass won't want to make its quiet support of the ruling class agenda that overt. The aforementioned chairman has already stated that the military will play no role in the outcome of the election. That's probably not a feint, but one wonders if it will hold, given the obvious attempt to influence military thinking, by people like Jeffrey Goldberg in his recent Atlantic essay. That was the piece I referred to in which Trump supposedly made these disparaging comments about the military. Can the Democrats rely on the Secret Service to drag Trump out? I have my doubts on this one. I've seen the service up close. It really is, or strongly appears to be, apolitical. It has a job to do, protect the president, whoever that is. Officers take that job very seriously. If they don't believe Trump lost, I don't think that they can be counted on to oust him. On the other hand, were they to believe he did lose and that he was refusing to leave, a scenario I find impossible to imagine, but the Democrats insist is just around the corner, it's possible the service would act. Now, again, what he's driving at here is an election in which the numbers seem to point to Trump winning, the Democrats insisting that Biden actually won, the Democrats trying to use all of their authority to insist that it is indeed a Biden victory, and possession being 9/10 of the law, they need to get Trump out of the White House. I know that this all sounds wacko. But as I say, Anton is a serious guy, and he's arguing that they're tipping their hand about these plans by openly planting out this notion Trump's going to refuse to leave office. Trump's going to refuse to leave office, so that if Trump does indeed, believing that he won, refuse to leave office, they could say, the guy lost, but he's refusing to leave office. So the determination of who won and who didn't win, this is me now, not the piece. This is key to their strategy. The media has to be claiming that Biden won without regard to what the raw vote total counts. And if these ballots come in day after day after day after the election is over, these mail-in ballots that were suddenly not found, and here comes another 55,000 from Cleveland, etc. You can see how this plays itself out. Back to the piece. The events of the last few months may be interpreted as an attempt to color revolution that failed to gain enough steam, or as a trial run for the fall. Is the Trump administration prepared? Here's one thing they could do. Play their own war game scenarios so as to game out possibilities and minimize surprises. They should also be talking to people inside and outside of government whom they absolutely trust to get a clearer sense of who on the inside won't go along with a coup and who might. They might also need to set up or shore up now communication channels that don't rely on the media or big tech. By the way, imagine during a scenario like this trying to post anything on Facebook defending Trump. You can't even post anything right now on social media defending Matthew Rittenhouse. Back to the piece. Once the ruling class gives word that the narrative is Trump lost, all the president's social media accounts will be suspended. The TV channels, with the likely exception of Fox News, will refuse to cover anything he says. Count on it. He's going to need a way to talk to the American people and has to find the means now. Now, this is me and not the piece. You can imagine disputed election. Trump's claiming he's winning. Oh, no, that's irresponsible. We can't put that out there. You think Twitter won't do that? Facebook won't do that? ABC, CBS, NBC won't do that? Back to the piece. For the rest of us, the most important thing we can do is raise awareness. If there is a conspiracy to remove President Trump from office, even if he wins, they're telling you about it precisely to get you ready for it, so that when it happens, you won't think it was a conspiracy. You'll blame the president. Don't be fooled. Again, that piece, which is certainly going to be perceived as controversial, written by Michael Anton. He's a research fellow at Hillsdale. He's affiliated with the Claremont Institute. He's a well-known guy. Will they actually try this? Will they actually go to these lengths? I don't know. But based on the things that I've seen this year, will people be willing to destroy the economy by hyping a virus, killing off the greatest economy in American history? Well, that all happened. Will you see Democratic mayors refusing to protect their own cities when riots are going on? Well, that all has happened. Will you see the mayor of Chicago stand by and essentially let her police officers do nothing when Michigan Avenue and State Street is gutted? Well, all that's happened. All that's happened. We've seen things this year that we never dreamed we would see in the United States. So, the thing of it is, if Trump loses on the square, if he just loses the election, I mean, whatever the vote count is, Trump loses. He didn't carry enough states. He loses a few of the battleground states that he won last time. They don't need to do any of these things. What if, though, Trump wins Wisconsin by, like he did last time, 20,000 votes? Suddenly, here come the mail-in ballots. Some clearly bogus. Counted anyway, perhaps. If the narrative is, and they can convince people, no, we really won. You got to count all the votes, and these votes keep coming in. And Trump disputes it all. Then they make the case, see, Trump's the sore loser. He's trying to establish his own coup. He's refusing to leave. That's what Anton's claiming they're all plotting here. That's how desperate that they are to gain the country back from him. And as I say, you would not find that any of this to be necessary on the part of the left if they actually thought they'd win on the up and up. But when you see people in a 10-mile line of cars to get to the Trump rally in Latrobe, as we described in the segment prior to this, that's what they're afraid of. Donald Trump's support is deep, and it is very loyal. And yep, it's about half the country. And he, as deep as that support is, that's how determined other people are to get him out, rationalizing as they do that it's for the good of the country. That point that's mentioned about Trump being able to communicate after the election is over, that his social media accounts will be suspended, that conservatives won't be able to post, etc. You've already seen how many accounts have been knocked down because people say the wrong thing about COVID, or they say the wrong thing about Black Lives Matter, or they say the wrong thing about police shootings, or they say the wrong thing about Kenosha. I'm not trying to engage in any paranoia here. I wanted to share this perspective, though, because it's interesting, and it comes from a guy who's not a wingnut. There are wingnuts out there who've been talking about they've been talking about these kinds of coups and conspiracies and evil forces forever and ever and ever and ever. It just seems more real now. There are a couple of other things that I think ought to be raised that I don't think enough people are particularly focused on as we move toward this election that, as you know, I have predicted that at least in terms of what the actual vote is, that Trump is going to win. News Talk 1130 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. This Atlantic story that came out, written by an anti-Trumpster, the magazine itself is owned by Democratic operatives. Now, is it possible that President dealing with something behind the scenes here. Sorry for losing my train of thought. Is it possible that President Trump blows off and makes a bunch of wild comments about the military being losers? To think that Donald Trump would make those comments, surrounded by his own chief of staff, his entire inner circle. Could Donald Trump shoot off his mouth and say something with one guy around him that he knows really closely? Well, all people have the capability of doing that. While president, to make a comment like this, knowing that his administration has leaked like a sieve from the beginning, it doesn't make any sense. The next thing that doesn't make any sense. Trump supposedly made these comments in 2018. All these people heard it, and we're learning about it now, as if this wouldn't have been leaked to discredit him 3 weeks after he said it, 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Then you take a look at all of the people that were present. This is when the military trip was, the trip to the cemetery was canceled. The Atlantic story is suggesting that Trump just didn't want to go and they used bad weather as an excuse. His administration now has already produced emails indicating that bad weather was indeed the reason that the trip had to be called off. At least the military flight was the flight and the helicopter flight was called off. The number of people who were present for this include a lot of people that Donald Trump has since canned. John Bolton can't stand Donald Trump. But John Bolton said, I was there. This didn't happen. The chief of staff to John Kelly, who was at the time President Trump's chief of staff, said it didn't happen. I think what you have here is a handful of military people and perhaps people close to Kelly who's unhappy he was sacked as chief of staff, throwing this thing out there. Now, Cheryl Atkinson, who's a conservative journalist, has pointed out that Donald Trump did, in fact, make comments like this referring to current military leaders by name. And that was widely reported in January. So that's all that actually happened back there in the day, that the rest of the story is simply a fabrication. You can look for a lot more of these. Every 4 years, the media and the left manage to invent a story, if either true or not, and spring it on people right before the election. I think the most famous was probably the W. Bush campaign in 2000, when that drunk driving from 20 years earlier was suddenly appeared in the media 5 or 6 days before the election. You can look for a bunch of these nonstop. I just don't think, do I think Donald Trump was capable of saying something like this 20 years ago? Yes. We know, just as Donald Trump made the comments in the Access Hollywood tape and so on, Donald Trump was one of these guys who'd say outrageous things, go on Howard Stern's show, do outrageous stuff here, there, and so on. Do I think he would do this? Surrounded by military officials, surrounded by his own chief of staff, surrounded by his staff? No. Furthermore, if he had said something like this, he'd be saying things like this all the time, and there's been no leak of any other comments that are like this. This is an invented, fabricated story planted for the purpose of cutting into one of Trump's strongest bases of support, which is the military itself. Do not expect the left and the media to play fairly. The story in the Atlantic, uncorroborated, with unnamed sources, denied by everybody else who was there, appeared on the top of page 1 of the print edition of the Journal Sentinel in Milwaukee. This story was instantly plastered out and jumped upon and circulated by everyone. In the meantime, let's size up the Democratic campaign. Everybody knows why Joe Biden's not taking questions. We've now caught him on a teleprompter having to read answers. We also know that many of the questions have been scripted by the Biden campaign and planted to the reporters who are reading off their script. We all get that. Joe's over the hill. Joe can't answer any questions. Joe's got to read his answers. Even when he reads them, they're all screwed up. None of that explains, though, why Kamala Harris isn't answering any questions. This was her appearance over the weekend with Mandela Barnes, Lieutenant Governor of the state. Listen to Mandela Barnes' introduction of Kamala after Kamala made brief comments to the media.
We are very honored, proud, and lucky to have Senator and soon-to-be Vice President Harris with us today. And I will pass it back over to you, because I know you want to take some questions before you get out of here.
Oh, we're all set.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
We're all set. Thank you.
Why did
Thank you, Paul.
That's
We're
it.
headed out the same way we came.
I once lived in Wisconsin.
Barnes apparently wasn't told Kamala doesn't answer any questions. No, she's done. She's out of there. This is one of the more unusual campaigns in American history. You have neither Biden nor Harris answering any questions. I think the fear that they have is that not only will Biden wander off script with his ravings, they're afraid that she's going to say something that is off script. So they're simply not going to take anything. If this was being done by Trump, and this is being done by Pence, if they wouldn't answer anyone's questions, I mean, it would be the only story that you would ever hear about. Instead, Trump gets up there for an hour and a half every day, taking this question, that question. Pence will answer anybody's question. They're all out there, constantly out there, responding to the most hostile attack questions imaginable. Biden and Harris are afraid, or their handlers are afraid, to let them answer literally anything. That was perhaps explainable with Biden. It is eye-opening that they don't even want to let Kamala Harris answer any questions, even knowing that the questions are likely to be softballs. Final thought on that. Why do they feel the need to zip her lips too and keep her on a script? I think they're afraid that if she says something and they bring that question back to Biden, he might end up contradicting her. They have so little trust in their own candidate for president that they have to control the script of everyone who speaks on behalf of the campaign, and controlling the script means that no one responds to any questions that would require an answer that is ad lib.